Hey Steve, how you doing?
I am all right, Dave. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. So we're not in the same room today. We're going to try doing this remotely.
We're not. I'm in a booth of shame at the office.
Yeah, and I'm as you can tell in the home office, surrounded by all the random things that are in here. So we'll let people who watch this try and figure out my life story from from what's going on behind me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to talk today about something we touched on when we talked about our services and our approach, but we're going to deep dive a little bit into the idea of proactive security and why our approach and our philosophy is very much about getting upstream, doing things proactively rather than reactively.
Mm,
So we'll talk a bit about the concepts. We'll talk about how it can be done and how we do it. But let's just start with the basics. So, what do we mean when we talk about proactive and reactive security when we're talking in terms of cybersecurity?
yeah. Well, I think this is a really good topic and one that we like to make a lot of focus or put a lot of focus on. What do we mean? So we always try and kind of focus on risk and try and stay risk centric. And what do we mean by risk? Well, the breakdown of risk equals threat times likelihood times impact or probability and impact, if you want to use that language. And it's the summation of those three different variables. Now, when we're talking about cybersecurity, we don't really have an awful lot of control over the threat piece. The threat piece is controlled by somebody else. The best thing that we could possibly do is understand the threats that we're facing as an entity or organization. So threats controlled by the bad guys. So that really means that we've got two variables, two levers that we get to pull to try and control the risk, and those are probability or likelihood and impact. When we talk about proactive versus reactive cyber is an important part of the calculus, but reaction tends to be more focused on impact management. So something is happening. A key part of managing the impact of that bad thing happening is being able to spot it, right? So this is where like traditional security operations centers, 24/7 monitoring, these types of things come into it. And that's about impact management. But it's not the only variable that we get to control or the only lever that we get to pull. We also have another lever, which is the probability piece. And probability management is about configuring your digital estate so that the bad thing doesn't happen in the first place, right? It's about preventing that thing from happening and reducing the probability that you're facing an issue to begin with. And that comes from things like configuring your digital estate for security, layering in controls, following a security philosophy like defense in depth and zero trust, and these types of frameworks that we can put in place, these controls that we can put in place to reduce the probability of something happening in the first place. Our philosophy is, yes, we have to do the impact management, we have to do the detection and response piece, but philosophically I would rather focus the majority of our efforts on preventing the bad thing from happening in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's an analogy I like to use here. If you think about your business's physical security or protection, so detection and response, the reactive part of security, I guess is like having CCTV systems and sensors, and maybe having a company who's monitoring those. Maybe you've got like a third party security company monitoring those and
Yep,
sitting there ready to react when those sensors trigger or when something's spotted on CCTV, and they will turn up and maybe chase away the bad guys or whatever. Um, but the reality is, like, if you never lock the doors, if you leave all the doors open and the windows open, then the reality is that you're still going to get robbed. Somebody's still going to be able to get in and steal something, even if that response happens, even if they turn up every single time. And then proactive security, then for me, is about okay, we lock the doors and the windows, but also like we control the keys. We know who has got
mm-hmm.
access to what, or maybe certain doors are only opened at certain times when they need to be. There's only a requirement
Absolutely.
to open the loading bay door when you're doing some loading because that's the time at which somebody could get into it. So
Absolutely.
that's an analogy I sort of like to think of here. So I guess thinking that through, then, I mean, you touched on some of the sort of controls, but what does that look like? What are the models for implementing that proactive security?
So there's different ways of implementing it, and I would suggest that every organization is going to have a different approach here, and there's no kind of one size fits all. And so, uh, if you look at the way that we implement that, we do that in various models. So one model is we actually take on the entirety of the delivery, right, for our clients. So we've got a couple of clients where they just want to turn the key and say, you handle all of our digital estate, both the provision of the assets and the utilization of the assets, in this case, laptops and accounts and these types of things, but also the security of those systems, right? And so we can certainly do that. We don't tend to do that an awful lot. What we tend to do is work more either with an internal cybersecurity team. So think a company that's big enough that they have a small team or even a large team internally who focuses on the IT provision, so the provision of the digital assets, and we just come alongside of them and sit alongside of them as their cybersecurity kind of partners. And so we, in collaboration, are responsible for the provision of the assets, but the provision of the assets in a way that manages the risk, right? Coming back to the risk. Another model could be they just want to outsource their IT and they have an external provider, somebody who's external to the organization. And again, we like to take a collaborative approach here. What we do is we come alongside and sit alongside of them and work very closely with them. Obviously, getting that right is going to be really key, because there are going to be times where timing matters. And so we need to work very closely with them to figure out, who's responsible, who's accountable for certain things, who's informed, how do we consult. But the idea is that we want to work in collaboration with these entities. We're not there to mark anybody's homework.
And I think the thing that says to me is that the importance of the understanding of security and the importance of understanding what proactive security actually looks like. So, an IT service provider who's focused on availability has probably got some good ideas about security, and quality of those services may vary, and we know that, we see that. But an IT service provider is primarily focused on making sure that the lights are green and everything is blinking.
Yeah,
And what I've certainly seen is an IT provider will maybe or an internal team will buy some security tooling, but invariably that's focused on the impact management side of things. Buying
yeah,
a managed detection and response tool or service, or whatever that might be, and then you get this gap. And I think that gap is where so much of that risk is, where that you're just not managing the likelihood of a cyber incident happening. You're not managing the probability. If we think about a risk matrix, a risk vector, where you can put as much tooling in place as you want to detect things as quickly as possible and to respond as quickly as possible. That's great,
that's
and
right.
all of that will bring the risk further along one axis in terms of the impact, but it does absolutely nothing about the probability or the likelihood of an attack or an incident happening in the first place. So that for me is where
Absolutely.
this understanding of what does a secure enterprise look like? What is hardening all about? What does it mean to implement conditional access? What does it mean to ensure that only compliant devices can get access to certain bits of data or application?
Yeah, 100%. And I'll be honest, a lot of companies, lots of cybersecurity companies don't like doing this. Why? Because it's really hard. Whenever you're changing, you're making changes to a digital estate in a client's kind of systems. You have to work with them. You have to do a bunch of change management, communications. You have to kind of be part of their team, and that's a hard thing to do. And a lot of cybersecurity companies, they don't like doing that. That's where we love it. That this is what we love doing, is working really closely with these organizations to not just tell them when to do the security, but actually to get in and do the security, right? And yes, of course, we will then go into 24/7, 365 monitoring. It's a key part of the calculus. But at that point, if we've got that right, the number of times that we actually have to respond are, they're a lot less than if we didn't do the work in the hardening.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the other things that I've certainly seen in different conversations is kind of, okay, when do you need to do this hardening? When do you do proactive security? Is it a project? Standing up a new business, or you think can you do it do it once and then you're kind of good. Um, or actually, I think as we would say, the reality is, this is an ongoing challenge, and whether it's changes in threats, changes in business requirements, or just Microsoft changing something because they like to do that and not tell anybody, this is a constant effort, right?
100%. Yeah. So we come back to risk equals threat times probability times impact. Anytime you're making changes to a digital estate, the probability changes. And that's just by nature of the fact that things are changing. But also the threat environment is changing. Hackers are finding new ways of exploiting systems. There are new vulnerabilities that are discovered. New threat actors come online, and they may take a very unique approach to exploitation. These types of things, they have a big impact on how the kind of threat changes or how the risk changes over time. And so, looking at something, as a snapshot, at a point in time, is going to help for that point in time, but it's not going to help in perpetuity. And so, to really get this right, we have to create, an enduring and durable kind of campaign of cybersecurity to manage the risk over time.
So then, what about AI, right? Because everything's AI at the moment. Anyone who was at InfoSec recently, every single stand was agentic powered AI, this, that, or the other. There's a whole thing around AI powered detection tools, but I think
Yeah.
we've talked about the bit about detection and response. I don't think we need to go back around that boy again, but obviously one of the big cybersecurity stories of the year has been Claude Mythos and then the other frontier models, and their ability to find cyber vulnerabilities and exploit new vulnerabilities or chain together exploits much more quickly than previously. What does that mean in this model of proactive and reactive security?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and you're right. Like AI is everywhere, for good reason, right? There's a lot of human progress that's being made right now as a result of AI. Obviously, we need to get the balance right, as with anything in humanity. From a cybersecurity perspective, though, there's a little bit of hyperbole in it. What do I mean by that? Well, yes, it's true that Mythos is rapidly changing the pace at which vulnerabilities in software are found. Right. I guess the flip side to it is, well, if you get it right, then software manufacturers are also going to be using large language models to patch these systems and to create fixes for the vulnerabilities that are found in that software. Now, this is a traditional thing that's been going on since software was invented. Um, the difference here is that we've just got large language models that are changing the pace at which these things happen. The other thing I'd suggest is our philosophy is something called defense in depth. We don't rest on one control. We used to do this as cybersecurity professionals. We'd stick everything at the edge, and we call it a walled garden, and that the walls were firewalls, right? Like we'd literally put firewalls at the edges of the networks. We still have firewalls, but we don't just rely on firewalls. We have a whole series of controls that cover each other off, right? And so what that means is even if there was a vulnerability in some software, we have a whole series of other controls that can try and manage the risk of that, right? So yes, it's something that we need to be aware of as a society, but do we need to be terrified of this in a way that some people are finding? No, I would suggest not. We do need to take it seriously, and we do need to respond to it, but I don't think we need to be concerned about the exploitability of every system on the planet in the way that some people are believing. I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the way I describe this is look, these tools, this new approach is accelerating something which happened anyway, but it
Yeah.
doesn't change the fundamental principles. Defense in depth, you've talked about, limited access, controlling who's got privileged access, zero trust, knowing who is inside your system and who's got access to what data. These things will all continue to protect, strong multi-factor authentication, ensuring that the right people have got access to the right things. And that their identity is verified. These principles all still stand true,
Yeah.
and actually form the core of a hardened security system. actually, coming back to my analogy, as you're going to stretch even further, maybe Mythos is just accelerating the speed at which somebody can find those open windows and open doors, and rather than having to search manually for them, well, now it can scan in an automated way and find those open windows and doors really, really quickly. But if we make sure that the windows and doors are closed, and also that the secure data is in a safe and locked in a vault, and again we've
Yep.
controlled the keys and all the rest of it, then actually it doesn't really change the principles.
And the risk is managed, right? The risk is managed. And I think that's the key thing. So, yeah, it's something to be aware of. I don't think we need to be terrified of it in the way that it is. It's just a matter of sticking to the core principles of zero trust, defense, and depth, and making sure that we're doing that over time, which are the things that we've talked about here.
Super. Well, we've covered quite a lot of ground there in quite a short time. I think that's probably enough for today. So there's some things that we'll no doubt come back to. I'm sure we'll talk about AI in pretty much every time we get together and speak. But for now,
Probably.
good to chat. Enjoy the booth of misery, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.